Well, as we're now a couple of minutes past the official start time, I think we'll move ahead and hopefully others will continue to join during the introductory comments. Can I welcome everyone this morning? My name is Ian Marcus, and as President of the Cambridge University Land Society, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this, the latest in our series of ESG seminars. This is actually the 10th event we've held since beginning this initiative during the pandemic lockdown. The program's been enormously successful. We've had literally thousands of people in aggregate attending, and for which we are very grateful to all of you. However, none of this would have been possible without the technical support and financial sponsorship of Savills, for which we remain very appreciative indeed. Although this is the last of the current series, I'm delighted to announce with Savills' continuing support, we will have a further programme of events after the summer, and drum roll, we actually hope to do some of these live and in-person events moving forward as well. Can I take the opportunity just very briefly make you aware of a couple of forthcoming CULS events. On Wednesday, the 15th of June, we've arranged a tour of Plumtree Court, the absolutely stunning new head office of Goldman Sachs, and will be hosted by Jim Garman, Head of Real Estate at Goldman's and a Cambridge alum. And on the 6th of July, we have a trilogy of events in Cambridge, including a tour of the Department of Architecture, our AGM, followed by our annual dinner at Fitzwilliam College. And further details are available on the website, but I would encourage both members and guests to join us at either or both these events. Returning to today's webinar, we focused a good deal previously on the E. Today, we turn our attention more to the S in ESG with a discussion and debate about social cohesion. Our industry is striving, as we've discussed in the past, to balance economic returns, environmental impact, and social responsibility. But accurately measuring social impact remains very challenging. So we're very fortunate enough today to have a panel who will help us better understand this challenge. And can I thank our speakers in advance for their time and contribution today. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce Eime Kotecha. She is chair of the CULS ESG and Sustainability Forum, without whom none of this would have been possible. I know she's a little nervous about having technical problems today, but hopefully Eime can now join us and welcome our speakers and facilitate today's discussion. Eime, over to you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Ian, and for introducing CULS and our kind sponsor, Savills, who have been sponsoring our ESG webinar series almost from its inception. We're very grateful that Savills have continued to offer their sponsorship into the next CULS year as well. Why does investing in social value in the built environment matter? That is our topic for discussion today, and we have absolute subject matter experts on that topic here in our as part of our panel to bring their views and perspectives to you and to share their distilled wisdom. There's a lot of talk about measuring S in that it's part of the ESG acronym. That stands for environmental, social, and governance. We've all become very familiar with this acronym in the last few years. But can the measurement of S in that respect actually lead to unexpected or unintended consequences? That too is part of our subject matter for discussion this morning. In order to set the scene a little bit for this discussion, it may be helpful for our audience to recall that the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992 was an important milestone in broadening our goals from environmental protection to sustainable development. And eventually it led to the adoption of the UN 17 Sustainable Goals, SDGs as we know them, which provide us with a blueprint for what we call good growth. The UN SDGs address economic, environmental, and social impact as equally important outcomes and tell us how to focus on each of them as part of an overall responsible investment strategy. And as you can imagine and appreciate, they actually lead to some very tangible strategies for the built environment sector. What the Earth Summit also did was to establish something which is now known as Local Agenda 21, an action plan for empowering local government to improve quality of life at the community level through greater action on managing and enhancing local resources for social, economic, and environmental outcomes. This, again, as you will appreciate, requires a kind of shared vision between the public sector and the private sector, creating partnerships with local communities and local groups to deliver what the local community would appreciate as social value and social outcomes. And with that introduction, I would like to hand over to each of our panelists to first of all introduce themselves and then to present their slides on this very important topic, which is social value, and to perhaps help us in demystifying how we can get ourselves there as in the built environment sector. So first of all, I'd like to invite Sophia Gibson from CBRE to introduce herself and to present her slides. Thank you, Sophia.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. It's really exciting to be here. I am Social Value Lead within CBRE, so I play a role within the business to support our real estate investor and asset management clients to evaluate and deliver social value. And I'm hopefully going to play a bit of a scene setting role in terms of this discussion. So yes, I'm going to, in hopefully these kind of fairly light touch slides, speak to some of the definitions of the key terms that will come up later on in the discussion. I'm going to talk very briefly about how we measure social cohesion and social capital, and how both of those things might change in light of some emerging regulation coming out of the EU. So first up, definitions. In the description about this event, you will have seen the terms social value, social capital, and social cohesion used. They are obviously quite similar and can often be heard used almost interchangeably, but I think it's useful for us to reflect that they are very distinct terms, and while they interrelate, they do have different meanings. So on this slide, I've set out some of the most recognised definitions for each of those terms. So for social value, I've used the definition that was co-created as part of a bit of work I was involved in when I worked at the UK Green Building Council, which was to create a definition of social value that worked for real estate. And that set out that within the real estate context, we see social value as something that is created when buildings, places and infrastructure support our environmental, economic and social well-being, and in so doing support our quality of life. So even though the ultimate ambition is to improve quality of life, the scope is really quite broad. We're looking at environmental, economic and social well-being. And that's very much in line with the definition of social value within the Social Value Act. Secondly, social capital, the one that I've taken here is the one that Forum for the Future uses, and that's because for me at least, my first interaction with the term was through Jonathan Porritt's seminal book, Capitalism as if the World Matters. And what that sets out and what Forum for the Future sets out is this idea that social capital is something that supports human capital. So human capital is our intellectual and emotional and spiritual capabilities as individuals. Social capital is almost that glue that allows that to flourish. So it's things like our families, our communities, our businesses, trade unions, schools and voluntary organisations. So I see it as sort of two aspects to this, both the strength of connection between individuals, but also the organisation of it, what kind of hierarchies are in place to make it an efficient aspect or an efficient capital. And then lastly, social cohesion. So this is taken from health.gov and says that social cohesion refers to the strength of relationships and the sense of solidarity among members of the community. So my kind of take on the relationship between these terms is there's almost a kind of Russian doll relationship following from social value. So I see social capital and human capital as roughly equating to the social well-being component of social value. And likewise, I see social cohesion as part of social capital. So I think it speaks to that community aspect, those connections, the strength of those relationships, but not really that other side, that kind of what institutions and organisation we have in order to support those relationships. I should say this is very much my take, so I'd be really interested to hear thoughts from the rest of the panellists and obviously the audience when we get to that point. So how do we measure social cohesion and social capital? Well, the most obvious distinction is sort of primary data versus secondary data, when we go out and get information directly from people versus when we rely on secondary sources such as this one. So this is the ONS's social capital in the UK report, which is based around 24 indicators. I recognise it's a very text-heavy slide. I wouldn't recommend trying to read it now, but it might be something I would definitely recommend kind of going and looking it up. These are the 24 indicators which the government feels best speak to our social capital. For me personally, I think they're more about cohesion. I think they're more about that frequency of interaction between people and the kind of the sense of trust that you get between communities. I think it has a bit more of a leaning towards that. But it's obviously really useful data. So we can use the secondary data as benchmarks when we're getting our primary information. I think where it falls short is where we don't have that primary information, because actually this data is it's presented primarily at the UK level. You can get it at the regional level, sort of southwest, northwest, etc. But when we're talking about real estate projects, we really want this kind of information at the LSOA level or the MSOA level, so that more local and hyperlocal level. And we know it's possible, so almost the equivalent to this, the Scottish Household Survey, that has data at the local authority level, which isn't perfect, but it's better than what we have at the moment. So that's sort of one area in which I hope our data on this and our measurement of this will improve. I think the other area is being really clear as an industry exactly what elements of building, design and operation almost directly correspond to a more socially cohesive community. So we kind of anecdotally or within various frameworks that we have, we know that things like providing spaces for interaction, such as gardens, increased connectivity, poor drawing, all these things can support social cohesion, but have we ever defined it in a sort of comprehensive way as an industry? And then very quickly, sort of the last thing that I want to talk about, which I'm finding very interesting at the moment, is some emerging regulation coming out of the EU. So those of you who are familiar with the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, it's supporting us in the financial world to classify investments, including real estate investments. Although it's not published yet, we do have, we know there will be a social taxonomy, and there was a report in February of this, which idea of what it would look like, both in terms of its scope and its approach. And the scope we kind of extracted here on this slide in the bullet points. And you can see scanning through those, but none of them really speak to this kind of topic of social cohesion. And I think that feels like an omission, because I think social cohesion is sort of something that we see intuitively as at the real heart of the S of ESG. So that's possibly, very probably, because it's something that is hard to measure, but maybe it's something that we should be lobbying for being included in time. If it is, then what would that mean in terms of the data that we saw in the previous? Looking at the hyperlocal level across Europe. So that would be an incredibly interesting thing to happen in terms of data, and incredibly useful for us as an industry. So I probably raised more questions than I've answered, but hopefully that was a useful kind of starter for this discussion. And I'm going to hand over to Guy.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for that very good introduction. Guy, over to you.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. And you can see my slides, yeah, Amy?
Yes, nice and clear. Thank you.
Okay, so just very quickly about our business. I'm Chief Executive of an organisation called Social Value Portal, and we help organisations measure their contribution to society. We do that through an online platform that helps measurement, procurement, contract management, and then final reporting. And we bring all that together in a kind of cohesive social value statement. So I want to dive into the subject matter of this discussion, and it's a really interesting question: does social value matter? And then the challenge around measurement. So I'm going to break into those, and I'm just going to build on one other definition, Sophia, that you didn't quite mention, which was ESG, and I think it's just worth just showing the comparison, at least in our view, about ESG and social value. And I think what's interesting about ESG, environmental social governance, that it's sort of, its birthplace was from within the investor community, and asking an organisation to assess its risk around its environmental and social impact. So it's a framework that's all about avoiding harm. It's about meeting regulation, and it's about disclosing ESG metrics. So, you know, do you have child labour in your supply chain? Are you using palm oil in your supply chain? These sorts of things. So it's a risk measurement framework. So if you're not meeting the requirements, the regulation, then you're breaking the law. So we don't see it as sort of, it's like the bottom of the pile, if that makes sense, but a really important bottom. Social value, by contrast, is the upside, and so we see that as a framework for maximising value creation. And so you're looking at a way that an organisation can express its contribution, so to create value, to benefit communities, and then create long-term benefit. There's a couple of pieces of legislation that are worth just noting. So you've got the Public Services Social Value Act that came out in 2012, and that defines social value as the social, economic, and environmental well-being of communities, and that requires all local authorities, all public sector, to embed social value in their procurement decision making. Out of that, more recently, 2 years ago, we got the construction playbook that relates directly to how buildings are procured by the public sector, and that requires a 10% minimum weighting on social value. So that basically means that if a private sector organisation wishing to win work with the public sector doesn't have a social value solution, it probably won't win that work. And those weightings are moving from 10% as a minimum now up to 15%, and in some cases 20%. So if you're working with the Ministry of Justice, they have a 20% weighting on their decision making. And the second part that we're finding is that it's transforming the public sector, and we're now seeing the benefits of the Social Value Act leaching into planning. And so you've got a number of councils, Bristol, Salford, Southampton, Manchester, now requesting social value statements as part of the planning submission. Within the local plan at Salford, this is a requirement, so you won't get a planning permission unless you have a social value statement. So Salford are asking for that contribution to society. So it does matter, because without it, you're not going to be able to A, win work with the public sector, and B, get planning, which is the lifeblood for real estate, obviously. So what does it mean in reality? So, you know, I think it's really important to understand that social value isn't sort of some ethereal virtual term, and actually it's got some real deliverables, real outcomes. So employment for local people, job opportunities for those furthest from the job market, low carbon, diverted waste, accessible spaces for local people. These are all the sort of the elements of social value that an organisation needs to think about and needs to be measured to assess what they're doing. And just to bring that alive, in a way, the most prosaic of opportunities. So this is a company that produces signs, motorway signs, You know, you wouldn't think there's much in this, and there's not much to choose between one sign company and another sign company. Well, there is, because this particular company I'm talking about, called Nuneaton Signs, they're a social enterprise, and they employ 80% of their people from disadvantaged backgrounds. So in some form or other, they have a disability. So if you've got the same price, same quality, it's the same sign, and you've got a choice between one company that is declaring profits as normal, not doing anything special for the community, another company that's employing 80% of people from who are disabled, then it's kind of a no-brainer as to why you would do this. And this is the reality of what social value is doing. It is transforming the supply chain. It's transforming the relationship between the public sector and their suppliers, and it's beginning to transform the relationship between the private sector and their suppliers, because it's about sort of making good go further and go further with your decision making. It is possible to measure it. We've been measuring social value for 7 or 8 years now. We developed something called the National Social Value Measurement Framework, otherwise known as the National TOMS. Known as the TOMS because it's made up of a series of 5 themes, 20 outcomes and 48 measures, built around a triple bottom line framework. So that's economic being jobs and growth, the community piece being social, and then the environment. And then we have an innovation one to capture additional values. But what's important about this, it allows an organisation to benchmark what they're doing, compare how they're doing against others, and importantly allows a buying authority to assess one offer against another offer. But the thing about real estate is it is unique because it is something that runs through the full life cycle. And so we see that social value is delivered across people, place and planet through the full life cycle of the building, through consultation, planning, construction, property management and into occupation. And so it's really important that we think about how a building is not just an asset to deliver rental returns and capital gains. It's actually an asset for a community that delivers social cohesion and community gains. We put a number to that, and the number's important, not because it tells you sort of how many things are happening, and it's not really about people, it's just about understanding scale. And I think that's the big difference between sustainability and social value when you put a number to it, is that it is big. This is what we've done over the past 5 years, help unlock £11 billion worth of social value. But that's just a number to understand scale. What sits behind it is all of these. So jobs for 17,000 jobs for people from further from the job market, community spend, donations. This is what the Social Value Act and social value is all about. It's about having real tangible change for communities. So just finally, to answer the question, does it matter? Well, of course it does. And I think it particularly matters in our built environment, because our built environment is all about people and community. It's what makes our communities. And so I think it's fundamental to that. Are there unintended consequences for measurement? Yes, there are. But I would argue that those unintended consequences are usually always on the upside. Yes, we put a value to it, but when you measure something, you can manage it. And importantly, if you're managing it, then you can do more of the good stuff. You can reduce the negative impact and you can maximize the positive impact. With that, I will stop and pass on to Eime to take over.
Thank you. Thank you, Guy. Let me share my slide as well. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can. Yep. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So yes, so my name is Eime Tobari. I'm an independent social value strategist. I'm trying to help organizations embed social value in their core business strategy and operation. And just to clarify at the beginning that I will be using my slides, but I won't be able to explain all the single details of the slides in this talk. So please feel free to drop your questions to Q&As or follow up by email and individually. I'm happy to elaborate. So I'd like to start with a question: measuring or not measuring? So let's unpack this question by thinking what exactly we are measuring and why? Firstly, I think it's important to differentiate social value and social impact. And again, this is my take, and so it may differ from the views of other speakers or anyone in this room or elsewhere. So first of all, social impact is, in my view, linked to actions that individuals or organizations take, for example, creating jobs, financing social housing, creating open spaces, and so on. And a social value is linked to social outcomes, including social cohesion, social well-being, prosperity, equity. And these are cumulative effects of those actions and interactions between them. So measuring impact is important to monitor and manage it, as well as to report back to stakeholders, such as investors. And most of the measuring practice actually deals with this impact. In general, it is considered to be appropriate only to calculate net impact, things that wouldn't have happened without their intervention. And some measures used are often outputs, such as number of jobs, which are used as proxies for outcomes, for example, better quality of life or social mobility. And some are specific outcomes in a certain geographical area, such as reduction in homelessness. And as important as they are not social value in its broadest sense, in my view. As discussed in the ULI report, zooming in on the S in ESG, which I co-authored, social value is a dynamic, context-specific concept that involves moral questions. What is called social cohesion? How does equitable society look like? Who and where is a community? So if you ask these questions to 100 people, we would probably get 100 different answers. And also what good looks like could change over time as context changes. So it's moving target. The challenge for measuring social value is that firstly, any measures would be elements and proxies. I'm not saying it is bad, but we just need to be aware of that. And secondly, even if we get to measure something like social cohesion, it is difficult to link that with a certain intervention because most likely hundreds of interconnected factors contributed to it. And that's true for negative outcomes as well. So no single entity alone is entirely responsible for, say, social unrest or decline of neighborhoods or socioeconomic inequality. So what is the measure for? So what is more important, in my view, is to create social value. And so what can we do collectively? And I'd like to highlight two key points, alignment and stewardship. Firstly, focus on alignment, not quantity. It is difficult to delineate how much contribution a project or intervention has made to a social outcome, but we can qualify or sometimes quantify alignment of outputs with objectives. And this is why setting out objectives is one of the most important steps. And KPIs and metrics can be used to help aligning decision-making with objectives. And secondly, one of the biggest challenges for social value creation is in our industry is, as we discussed in the reports again, fragmentation of ownerships and responsibilities in our sector. And we need to develop a collective stewardship model involving investors, developers, asset managers, local authorities, and local community. So measuring social outcomes is important so we can monitor our progress as a society and learn lessons as an industry. But measuring should, however, be used to support a collaborative, constructive action rather than blaming. And I strongly believe that blaming culture is counterproductive for social value creation because it hinders collaboration and innovation, which are both essential for social value creation. So I'll finish there as some thoughts for further discussion, and I'd like to pass the baton to Pete.
Thank you very much, Eime. Over to you, Pete.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Really honoured to be here. I wasn't planning on sharing a slide, but actually, as the discussion's gone on, I might do, if you don't mind, just share two slides that explain where LNG is coming from with this. Has that popped up on your screen? Okay.
Yes, thanks, Pete. It has.
Theory of change. Yep. Okay. So apologies for not asking the organisers permission to do this, but it just seemed very pertinent as we were speaking and as part of the previous discussion. So Pete Gladwell, Group Social Impact and Investment Director at Legal & General. I work in LNG Capital, which is Legal & General's own balance sheet, as opposed to the fund management arm of LNG, which is LGIM. So I just thought it might be helpful to share a couple of slides, and these aren't marketing slides, these are actually internal slides. I never shared them before externally until last week when I was talking to a couple of local authorities about pension schemes, about how we approach this. But so this is very unpolished and I'm sure could be improved upon, but may help to explain how we, as one of, if not the UK's biggest investors, are looking at this and trying to ensure that we're having an impact. So why are we interested in having an impact in society? Well, firstly, because a few of us morally and ethically care about this, care about people. I think it's important that we put people at the heart of investment decision making. Commercially, also because I think we all recognise that if we as an industry want to keep stewarding people's pensions and savings, we need to demonstrate to them that this is about more than generating great financial returns, although it is obviously a really important element of everything we're doing, but also about how we're investing their pensions and savings back into improving their places. And so that we genuinely view part of our role in society being to invest back into places to improve social value, as well as generating financial returns. Can you still hear me? My face has disappeared.
Absolutely fine. Thank you, Pete.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks. Thanks for the reassurance. So how do we do that? Well, just to start at the top, and I won't go through this whole slide, but where we start and our theory of change, how we believe we really can have an impact, starts at the top there by identifying where in society there is a social need for investment. So we do a huge amount of work with local authorities and local communities, as someone has already asked in the Q&A about community engagement, about where is there a need for investment in society. That may be at a very granular, local, community level. It may also be at a nationwide level. Even all the investment in a new registered provider for us was driven by a recognition that we'd been knocking around as a team for 5 or 6 years, that the social housing sector needed more equity investment if we were to deliver the amount of social and affordable housing that this country required. So that's a big national issue. There's also very kind of granular local issues. And so what we're trying to do is work with the most appropriate experts and community groups and those who really understand society to identify where is there a need for investment. Again, that's not as being entirely altruistic as well, because I would really argue this, and I was arguing this with a journalist in the Times only yesterday, that the more we can identify the need for society for a longer term investor, the better the risk-adjusted return we will make. Because if we invest in things that society needs, actually we'll generate a better return in the long run, because society will pay us for those investments. If I wash some of LNG's dirty laundry, to give you an example, and LNG invested a lot of money in RBS bank branches before the pandemic, and we have also invested 250 million into 4,000 social homes around the country. Now, it's needless to say that less of society is going into those bank branches now, and so we've had to do a lot of work reconfiguring that portfolio. But the social housing investment we made has delivered a fantastic risk-adjusted return because it keeps paying out income that's aligned with inflation, that perfectly matches our pension commitments that we've made to 8 million people around the country. And so by correctly identifying where we could invest in assets that met a social need, we've not just generated some social impact, and enabled that registered provider to release a lot of equity to do a lot of good in society, we have also generated some very good commercial risk-adjusted returns as well. So the main thing I wanted to communicate, if there's one thing to leave you with, is for me, a key part of our role as an investor and an investment manager is looking for where there is a need for investment in society and working really hard to work with local authorities, combined authorities, and you may have seen our £4 billion partnership with West Midlands Combined Authority. That is all about how can we engage with them to find ways of meeting local need for investment across the West Midlands. And the first investment was not a shiny yuppie block of flats in the middle of Birmingham. It was social housing in Dudley, if you want a good example of where the rubber hits the road on this for us. So just to go around, what we're then looking to do is create those assets, generate an appropriate risk-adjusted return. And I want to stress this, that for us, actually having a positive social impact is creating that appropriate risk-adjusted return. You'll see some so-called impact funds who generate excess returns that I think actually are negative from a social impact perspective because they haven't, they're using the wrong type of capital. We might want to come onto that more in discussions, but just because you call yourself an impact fund doesn't mean you're socially accretive, I would strongly argue. But also then enabling the people and environment to thrive and looking for very clear, this is the other element I just wanted to stress to finish off, clear social outcomes. So now every investment that goes through LNG Capital's investment process, whether that's an investment in Oxford photovoltaics or for solar panels or an affordable housing investment or a new site for Carla, our house builder, or and the new urban regeneration scheme, for example, we just announced up in Glasgow with Bruntwood, we'll be looking.
Guy, I think we lost you there. Guy?
We'll also be auditing the hands around nice pretty pictures. Just to finish off with one last slide to show you what it looks like in practice and really bring it down to ground it hopefully in the reality of Newcastle, an old brewery site, the old Newcastle Brown brewery site that was cleared, then became an open cast coal mine, believe it or not. And this is actually a real life photo taken on my iPhone as I left the chief exec's leaving do the morning after the night before, as it were. But this is a real photo of what we, working in partnership with the local authority and university, have delivered. It's a huge district now, all about enabling startups from the university, particularly specialising in sustainability and ageing, to grow and stay within that local area, deliver economic growth, hugely sustainable buildings. You see 40,000 tonnes of CO2 reduced, lots of jobs, and Guy's organisation have been helping to benchmark the social impact of this scheme and this partnership. But you can see the various enablers that have gone on in there, the partnership with local authority and university to understand the need being critical. If you don't mind me maybe just sparking a bit of a debate to finish off, and this is perhaps where I slightly disagree with Guy. With all due respect to Nuneaton signs, this isn't about creating signs. And so it's really important for me that this social value does not become how many apprentices did LNG take on when we built this with the local authority, how many ex-convicts did we employ. Those are all fantastic things to aim for, and I'm really proud of the work our team is doing around mental health in construction, for example. So I'm not denigrating that in any way, but there is a bigger challenge for us as an industry, which is how do we create the things that society needs, the buildings, the places that society needs. And that goes beyond how we make the buildings to the very essence of what we're creating. And there's a really important element of social value that I think can easily be lost if we focus too much on the classic local authority definition of social value. And actually, for me, as I hope hopefully communicated, this is about identifying the need for investment and creating places in an ethical way that meet that need. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your excellent presentations that set the scene very well. We only have 15 minutes left, so we will have a quick round of Q&A now between the panelists. And we'll also try to take some audience questions. Thank you for starting to answer those while you were offline. So first of all, to kick off, from all your presentations, clearly the built environment sector has a place-based approach to social value. Now, the first question I want to ask the panelists is that appropriate, or are we, when we start putting people into the whole equation, and social value is about quality of life and creating better environments for people to live in, where do you see the drawbacks in a place-based approach, if at all? If I may start with Sophia.
Sure. I think I probably would struggle to find an issue with that. I think the view that I've always had, and very much was kind of instilled, particularly in the work that I did at the UK Green Building Council, is that we should be focusing on that kind of core value that buildings and places have on our everyday lives. And it's something really fundamental about how societies operate. And I think too often the temptation is to go for the stuff that's easier to measure, or to focus on the charity initiatives and the work done by the corporations who are operating within the built environment. But it's a bit of a distraction. We've got to keep drawing ourselves back to the place, the people who are in that place, and the relationship between the two.
Does anybody else want to contribute to that? Clearly, the people are transient. They're not always associated with a place these days, are they? That's the big issue in there.
I think the two really interesting dynamics around that for me are, there are certain things that society needs that no place wants to host. So yeah, I can think of lots of later living villages that L&G has funded or tried to fund, because we recognise there's a huge need in society for later living. Only to be told by a Surrey village that they didn't want any old people in their village. So I think we need to acknowledge sometimes that what we're doing is meeting a national need. I live in Harleston, a pretty rough area in London, and we've been campaigning against a waste to energy scheme. Well, I haven't personally, but friends have been down the road. I don't know where we hope the waste to energy scheme is going to be, because I suspect no one really wants a waste to energy scheme next to the house, but it's got to go somewhere. So I think sometimes, and the Green Building Council work does draw this out, there's a need to look at a national level as well as a place level. But really, really critically, a lot of these social issues are place. But if you look at health inequality, there is an overwhelming link between the place and health, healthy life expectancy. So a lot of these things can be tackled at a place level, even though they're involving individual people's lives.
Fantastic. Guy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's all about place. I mean, and because buildings are about place, right? So it's all about place. And just picking up the challenge that Pete put at my door, he's right. Actually, I'm not going to disagree with you, Pete. I think it's in definitions, as you and I have had this discussion. Anyway, I think the way I look at it is, let's compare it to the carbon story. Okay, so the carbon story has been quite interesting. So 10 years ago, 15 years ago, everyone was focused on operational carbon, i.e. the amount of carbon emitted during the operation. And there were a few of us ploughing that lonely furrow around embodied carbon, i.e. the carbon associated with building. And we now know that if you're going to achieve net zero carbon, you've got to look at both embodied and operational carbon. So just in that analogy, the embodied carbon is similar to what I'm talking about, i.e. the people employed to build a building, or however it might be, and that might be offenders trying to rehabilitate, etc., etc. And then you've got the operational piece, which is what Pete's talking about, which is the impact in the building. Both are, I would argue, important. Now, you could argue, and I'm quite happy to support this, that the use of the building facility is actually ultimately more important than how it's built and how the community is engaged around its construction. And I think that's because it goes on for many, many years, and the use of the building can make a massive difference to an area. I still think that's social value. But you're then talking about impact. So when we talk about social value, we talk about that full life cycle of a development. It's not only in how it's built, it's also in how the occupier engages, or the use of the occupier engages with the community. So it's that full life cycle, I think, really important.
Thank you. And from that perspective, some of these empty office buildings and office building owners need to be more considerate about what they're doing with that space, right? I can imagine lots of social value creation potential within those spaces at the current moment, and a big gap in what's available. Fantastic. Pete, you mentioned risk-adjusted returns and the longevity of this whole exercise, and there is clearly a temporal aspect that's imposed on top of the place or spatial aspect that you too mentioned, Guy. In one of your slides, you talked about the golden thread going through planning to procurement through to occupation, and Amy, you mentioned post-occupation. So there is a certain amount of risk that ESG metrics are referring to, that we're trying to mitigate to get us to those risk-adjusted returns that you mentioned. But yet we see that there's a misconception that ESG is basically another way of showing compliance and not performance and value. So given the fact that today we have this urgent need to address environmental impact, and it is broadly being done through measuring ESG related metrics, how are we going to create a new set of metrics, or a new yardstick, if you like, that does that spatial measurement, does the temporal measurement, takes us away from performance towards actual value creation? What are your thoughts? I mean, for the audience, we need something simple that can work. So give us your thoughts.
Do you want me to go first?
Amy, yeah, Amy, perhaps, and then follow.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I didn't know, yeah, go for it, Amy.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so in my work, that I start with impact mapping exercise, and I think that is the very important part. Before we get to the measurement, I think it's important that each organization, if they're trying to do something, understand how what they do as a core business relates to whom and how, and to identify opportunities, and then about how those actions and the impacts relate back to their organizational kind of goals and ambitions, as well as financial performance. That's a very important part of the core business. So understanding those elements, I think the relationships between interventions and outcomes, and these are very, very important first step. And without that, any measures wouldn't help. I don't think there is any more simpler answer than that.
So would you say, Amy, that it's not important or as important to take stock of where we are before we start to think about where we want to get to? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure if that's what I'm saying. I think we can build up on what we have been doing, but it's really important that we understand, so that it doesn't become compliance. It's important to understand that why do we want to do this? Why investing in certain things will become the benefit to us. I think Pete can probably elaborate more on that as a as a practitioner, because I think it looks at his approach that he presented, and the experience that he showed really represents that understanding of the loops and the feedback.
Fantastic. Pete, if you could elaborate on that, but also while you're at that, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing with the public sector, because there's one element that I'd like to bring in the interest of time. We don't have too much time left. We want to understand, at the end of the day, social cohesion, social value, all of that requires the public and private sector to act together. We need shared vision, we need partnerships. You alluded to that in your presentation. So responding to my previous question, but if you could also go into giving us some actual examples of how LNG have managed that, and also tell us, if you're a smaller organization and you don't have that vantage point that LNG enjoys, perhaps, then is a Nuneaton Signs like initiative important? Or I mean, you know, should we be looking at it from that perspective, that this is a smaller organization trying to make a difference, perhaps, rather than a very large one like yourself? So lots thrown in there.
A huge amount thrown in there. I mean, for me, first and foremost, this is about putting people back at the heart of what we do. You know, that's Sophia's laid out some excellent 3 different definitions. I kind of looked at that and thought, wow, that's you know, an impressive bit of research. But at the end of the day, for me, this is about whatever we do, thinking about, is this benefiting people and the planet? Is this creating spaces where people can thrive? So just to pick off a couple of things you said, and really to try and keep it brief, I do think getting the right timescales is important. I touched on this when I was speaking, but you know, as a developer, you will find it much harder to really create places that work for the longer term, because your commercial horizon isn't aligned with that of the public sector or society. There are some fantastic developers out there, though, who still do the right thing, despite not having that necessarily perfect commercial alignment, still create some fantastic places. So, and so for me, this is something that everyone can do, and likewise, everyone can fail at. And I mentioned there's some impact funds who I think are just pretty horrendous in terms of what they do in society, but they badge themselves as impact funds and have found some consultants who will claim they have a positive impact. So, you know, I found the discussions earlier this week, the chat from HSBC, just utterly fascinating, because in some ways I'm kind of pleased that some people are being a bit more honest, that they don't put people at the heart of their modus operandi, and being a bit more, you know, upfront about that. And I kind of hope, you know, in the same way as we're just seeing post-pandemic a wave of desire to reconnect society and create that social cohesion, that will come into our industry as well, and we can actually show that we can add so much more value to society than people realize. I can't go into all the examples. Newcastle was one, but there's 14 different cities we're invested in with partnerships like this, so I'm very happy to bore you with that later. Okay, is that all right?
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much. Sophia, over to you. You mentioned social taxonomy. Now, are we not talking there about more box ticking at the end of the day? Isn't it just following on from everything else the EU has done on the environmental side, addressing externalities by making them sort of very, very dry subject matters? I mean, is that the way we want to approach this in the UK? Or do you think we're going to take a slightly different stance about it? And also, going back to Pete's point, I mean, does that just shorten the lifespan of any action that we take by making it a taxonomy-driven action or implementation plan, rather than something that we want to perhaps see the value of, you know, after we've finished our careers?
Really interesting question. Just quickly, I wanted to respond to some comment or clarify from my presentation. There's lots of data that speaks to social value at the LSOA and MSOA level. Indices of multiple deprivation, the ALHA data. It's specifically the social cohesion elements that I put up on screen that I don't think we have at that hyperlocal level, which, you know, feels like a bit of a gap. So just to clarify that. And yeah, so in terms of the taxonomy, I mean, because at that level, we don't have as many parameters around the S of ESG. I can only see it as a good thing. And actually, I really like the approach that they've taken. So I didn't speak to this in the slide, but the idea is that you'd have a certain number of do no significant harm criteria, which are essentially your negative impacts. And then you'd have a certain number of strategic objectives that you have to prove you've made a substantial contribution to. They don't say within that those should respond to local needs, but it makes a lot of sense to me that across a particular portfolio of real estate assets, you want to check all of them are having do no significant harm criteria and all negative impacts. And then where there's local needs, in particular sites, you've responded and you've made an additional positive impact to to that need. So for me, if we compare it to sort of the main legislation that we have in the UK around social value, Social Value Act, it feels much more appropriate, exciting, relevant for real estate, in line with what we think about social value delivery and evaluation. So yes, it's another way of framing it, but I think it's a positive one.
Interesting. Does anybody want to add to that at all? Great. So at the end of the day, this is all about creating long-term public good, and that is predicated on trust. The one thing the built environment sector is not very good at, I'd like to say, is creating trust. That's been heightened to some extent because of everything we've been in the press for recently, being one of the largest emitters, the whole net zero carbon commitment thing. There's a lot of talk about greenwashing, etc., etc. So all of the avenues for trust have been brought into question. Eime, over to you to ask you, how do you think the built environment sector actually needs to go about creating trust? And then I'll ask Pete to perhaps give us some examples of how they have done that, or how they've created trust in a long-term kind of commitment, by perhaps making long-term commitment to communities. So Eime, if you could start, please.
Thank you. Well, that's a really big question. So I'll just say quickly that I think it is for the trust, the transparency is very important. And also with the transparency, it becomes the acceptance of collaboration. So the understanding, being transparent about the limitation as well. The social value is not something that a single organization can, entirely take responsibility for. So being honest about this is what we do. So, talk about the alignment with the overall objectives, the social value, but also accepting the limitation and then be open about collaboration.
Fantastic. Pete, or Guy, Guy, I would say.
Can I jump in?
Great. Yeah, yes, and there's a question for you in the...
Yeah, no, I'm going to answer it at the same time, actually. So I think trust is a really interesting one. So social value, however you want to define it, social value, social impact, offers a unique opportunity to rebuild that trust. So Grosvenor did a survey a few years ago now that showed that only 7% of the population trust the local authority to look after their interests in new development, and only 1% of the population trust developers to take their views into account, which is pretty dramatic, actually. And it shows that there is a massive trust deficit that we all need to recognise and embrace and build on. I think social value is about that. And I think more importantly around social value, let's talk about democratisation of engagement. And so I think we should ban the word consultation because it's meaningless. And I think probably all of us have been in consultation with developers where they consult and they do absolutely nothing with the information that comes back. It's just they fulfill their supposed planning democratic duty and they do bugger all with it, and it incensed me. Engagement is about listening and then showing and working with the community about how that engagement, their needs, their expectations have changed that development and how their views have been taken into account. And that democratization is fundamental and really important. And I think that is how we build trust. And I think social value is a part of that, but I think we have to get to that as a core, as a group within this industry.
Thank you so much, Guy. We're on the hour. Thank you all very much. We've learned about the importance of social value creation, about the longevity aspect and the temporal aspect, in addition to the place-based aspect. We've learned that we need to empower local communities, not just through participation, but actual democratization. And we've got our work cut out. So thank you very much to an excellent panel discussion and to our sponsor, Savills. And we look forward to seeing you after the summer. In the meantime, if you have any additional topics that you'd like us to discuss, please send an email to any of our organizers at CULS and we'll pick up from there. Thank you all and have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.